Hello, welcome to Face to Face with me. I'm Daisy Anwar, in a program that brings the world to your screen and where we meet people who make a difference to our lives. And in this episode, we talk about food security. Now, Indonesia is a country that is rich in natural resources and biodiversity. However, a lot of the farming lands are now being converted to plantation and sold to developers. And many of the farmers are finding it increasingly difficult to make farming a viable livelihood, and they're getting impoverished as a result. Now, I talked to Dr. Vandana Shiva. She's an environmental activist and a champion of biodiversity on how to address these issues. And according to her, one of the keys is actually to empower the farmers, such as, for example, by allowing them to have seed freedom so that they can save and cultivate their seeds without having to buy them. This will not only be good for the farmers, especially when it's done with organic farming methods, but it will also be good for the economy, food security and sustainability in the long run, as well as protecting nature. So, Face to Face with Vandana Shiva. I met Dr. Vandana Shiva on her trip to Bali recently. She was in Indonesia to see the rice field irrigation system called Subak, as well as to talk to farmers in Bali and other areas about the importance of seed freedom. Vandana Shiva, who lives in Delhi, India, is a prominent environmentalist, author, and long-time champion of traditional agricultural wisdom, notably the importance of saving seeds by farmers in order to ensure the sustainability of their livelihood. Indonesia, like India, is a developing country with a large population and plentiful natural resources. And yet, in both countries, despite the demand for grain and agricultural products, farming is a time-consuming and costly effort, and small-scale farmers remain the poorest members of society. Vandana, a staunch anti-globalization critic, believes that global trade and globalization, as well as the dominance of a few global players in agriculture and the production of food, have changed the ways developing countries exploit the land and taken away the traditional farmers' role as growers of food, as well as robbed them of the importance of their labor. Instead, economic pressures continue to plague developing countries, resulting in land exploitation and degradation, and further impoverishment of those whose livelihood depends on working on the land. There you are. Big hands for Dr. Vandana Shiva. I'm interested to know more about what Vandana considers as the dangers of globalization, particularly to traditional communities and the farmers' way of life. But do you see similarities between Indonesia and India? For example, I mean, Indonesia is, like India, home to a lot of nature, a lot of biodiversity, and yet we are also facing pressures, you know, whether it's climate change, forest fires, illegal loggings, land conversion, and also just general sort of economic pressures, especially with farmers perhaps losing a lot of their land for other different types of livelihoods. I mean, how do you see the direction in which we're going? Are we going to the right direction, or are we off in a tangent because of these sort of globalization and pressures?
Well, you know, India and Indonesia have such a long shared history, and a lot of that history has created rich cultures. It has created amazing cultures of peace and beauty. But we're living under one dominant culture, which we could just call globalization, which is, there's nothing natural about it. It was imposed with a lot of imposition, literally. Even the World Trade Organization rules didn't just get organically evolved from our national systems through a consensus at a global level. Each of the treaties of WTO was written by particular interests. Monsanto's on record to say the seed patenting laws they wrote. The vice president of Cargill, one of the biggest traders in agricultural products, wrote the agricultural agreement. The vice president was deputed to represent the US. And they define everything in agriculture as an issue of trade. But agriculture is culture. Agriculture is food security. Agriculture is the ground from where all cultures emerge. And that's why the last meeting of WTO in Bali was very significant. You know, India tries to orient its agriculture to food security. And we passed a law saying the last person has a right to food. And the US said, no, you got to trade in food and you got to facilitate trade, not facilitate the right to food. And I'm so proud that India absolutely refused to buckle down and said, we cannot sacrifice the rights of our people for the rights of corporations to trade. I think what's happened are two major, the two reasons why we are not just going in the wrong direction, but we are going in a collective suicidal direction.
Suicidal?
Suicidal for the human species at the planetary level. Because, we need clean water to drink. We need biodiversity as a ground for stability. We need a stable climate. And human beings have a very narrow niche on this planet. There's a certain temperature within which we can grow our food, survive, and live our lives. And for most of the evolution of this planet, the conditions didn't suit us. For the last 1,000 years, million years, the human species has evolved. And if we change the climate too much, for example, if we take temperatures to 4 degrees increase, or we make the systems that regulate the trade winds and the monsoon and the rain and create more droughts, more cyclones, more floods, every step we make sure our niche for survival closes down. Now, last year in my region of the Himalaya, we had such massive intensive rain we've never seen in history. And the Himalaya are the youngest mountain systems, unlike your mountains, which are volcanic. Ours are sedimentary. They've risen from the ocean. They're very fragile. And that heavy rain led to such heavy floods that we lost 20,000 people. So we're not talking about a distant crisis. If you add up all the issues, and there are interconnected issues which are not seen as interconnected. The same agricultural model that's destroying our biodiversity and beautiful landscapes like this and saying just grow corn. Most of that corn goes for animal feed and biofuel. Your tropical forests are being destroyed for palm oil. Most of it is going for biofuel. 90% of corn and soya goes for biofuel. 70% of the industrial food system is not functioning for people. 75% of all disasters, whether it be water disasters, or it be land and soil, or it be species extinction and biodiversity, and 50% of all climate change is coming from emissions from industrial and globalized agriculture. I wrote a book on this called Soil Not Oil. So we're talking about agriculture model and land use model that is grabbing land from peasants and saying you're not efficient enough. But those peasants are producing 70% of the food people eat and the most important livelihoods. Or it's driving down the prices that farmers get so they can't make a living. Between land grab and an unjust and unfair agricultural economy, we are killing the very sources of our food. And then we are producing stuff that is called food, but in my view is not food, because it's causing disease. Food is supposed to nourish us. It's supposed to give us health. 75% of the diseases of today, malnutrition, obesity, diabetes. And I notice at the airport while traveling, obesity is starting to grow even in this country. And with it, the risk of diabetes, cancers. Every second week, we have someone coming in from villages with cancer and we have to help. So we're talking about epidemics that are of such a high level. And these are never connected to the way we use land. And the economics of it is constantly distorted. because all costs are externalized.